Hello to everybody. Some time ago I was watching a TV documentary about a young boy who was stabbed to death by members of a gang. And naturally the question arose, well, what were his parents doing that they would allow him to get involved with a gang? But the show interviewed various people, including qualified professionals, who said it wasn't the parents. It was a good family, it was a loving family, and the parents did so much for their son to give him every opportunity. The gang used various strategies to lure the boy into their group, and having done so, they then killed him. And so we have that illustration about guilt, the question of responsibility, whose fault is something, and that comes up day by day. We see it constantly on the news with various trials that go on that set out to discover the guilt of various parties. And as we see in the reading in John chapter 9, the disciples raised such a question with Jesus. As they were going along, they come across a man who's been born blind, and they say, well, who's at fault? Is it the parents or is it the man himself? Well, if he's been born blind, it can hardly be the man's fault that he's blind. So then the implication is there that, oh, well, it must be the parents that are at fault. And so things like this go on and on. Whose fault is something? Who's to blame for something? Who's responsible for something? Now, here in John chapter 9 and verse 3, Jesus said it's not the parents who are to blame. They weren't responsible for their son's blindness. And so it is in other situations. We can't automatically assume that parents are at fault when things go wrong for the younger generation or when they follow the wrong path. You've got King Herod. Sometime after the birth of Jesus, he kills all the young male infants in and around Bethlehem. But that wasn't the parents' fault. It was Herod's fault. And we've seen in more recent times how many children died during the Second World War, children of Jewish parents, and also children of other ethnic groups as well. Many of them died. But again, it wasn't the parents' fault. It was the fault in that case of the Nazis. And so we can go on with that. Come over to the book of Ezekiel chapter 18 and the first 4 verses. So Ezekiel 18, and I'll start in verse 1. Then the Lord came to me saying, what do you people mean by using this proverb about the land of Israel, saying, the fathers eat sour grapes, but it is the children's teeth that have become blunt? And the meaning of that proverb is the parents do the wrong thing, but it's the children who pay the price. But God goes on in verse 3, as I live, declares the Lord God, you certainly are not going to use this proverb in Israel anymore. Behold, all souls are mine, the soul of the Father as well as the soul of the Son is mine. The soul who sins will die. And then in verses 19 and 20, yet you say, why should the Son not suffer for the punishment for the Father's guilt? When the Son has practiced justice and righteousness and has kept all my statutes and done them, he will certainly live. The person who sins will die. A son will not suffer the punishment for the father's guilt, nor will a father suffer the punishment for the son's guilt. The righteousness of the righteous will be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked will be upon himself. Children can take responsibility for their own lives. Children can't always blame their parents. Even when the parents are doing the wrong thing through the child's growing up, nevertheless, children can still make choices. For instance, Judah's king Ahaz was sinful, according to 2 Chronicles 28. Yet his son Hezekiah was righteous. He chose not to follow his father's path. And then we go on, Hezekiah was righteous, but his son Manasseh was evil. So he chose to reject his father's path. Parents can have a negative influence upon their children. And yes, children can choose whether or not to follow that, but at times it's very hard for children to break with the parents' influence. As we've just seen with the kings, even in the one family, you might have evil influences, shall we say, and yet somebody chooses to break with that. You might have parents who do the wrong thing, and some of the children follow that, and some of the others choose not to follow it. You've got an example, for instance, in a family where, say, the father might be a heavy drinker, and yet there are children who choose not to go down that road, perhaps because they've seen the consequences. So we can't say that children are bound to follow in their parents' footsteps. And certainly, as we see in the book of Ezekiel, children are not punished by God for the sins of their parents. So on the one hand, parents are not necessarily the cause of children's suffering or of children's sinfulness. And yet there are times when parents are the cause, where parents do have responsibility. And that might be in two ways. Parents might be either indirectly the cause of their children's problems, or they may be directly the cause of their children's problems. So let's just take the first one. Parents might indirectly be the cause of their children's problems. Parents might not cause their children to do the wrong thing, but nevertheless, the parents, through their own conduct, may bring about consequences as a result of which the children suffer. For instance, gambling. That's a big problem in Australia. And one of the problems with gambling is that the parents blow the money, or the father or the mother blows all the money, and there's nothing left for the family. So the children suffer because of a lack of funding. The same thing can happen, for instance, when a parent is imprisoned, particularly if it's a long stretch. The rest of the family then have to find a way to survive without that parent's income. Parents might be drug addicts, parents may be alcoholics. The list goes on, and as a result of that, the family perhaps is short of funds, perhaps loses their house because of non-payment of the mortgage, all of these things. And so the rest of the family, including the children, suffer as a consequence of that. And there's various examples of this in the Bible. We can go back to Genesis, the 6th chapter, for instance, beginning in verse 5. This brings us to the time of the flood. And Genesis 6, verse 5, then the Lord saw that the wickedness of mankind was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. So the Lord was sorry that he had made mankind on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. Then the Lord said, I will wipe out mankind, whom I have created from the face of the land, mankind and animals as well, and crawling things and birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. And then you drop down a little bit further to verse 11. Now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for humanity had corrupted its way upon the earth. Then God said to Noah, the end of humanity has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of people. And behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth. And that leads into the flood, and all those other than Noah and his family die. So the parents, the older generations, brought about a situation where the whole society was marked by corruption, and thus God sent the flood, and young people, children, infants died as a consequence. So they died indirectly, shall we say, because of what the parents created in the world in terms of evil. Now, I know that raises a question of the justice of God. Was it fair to let God allow the infants to die? And I have talked about God's justice at past times and have written on it at different times in our old church newsletters and so forth. One of the things that we have to keep in mind in all of this is the eternal nature of God's schemes. That yes, people die, but that isn't the end of it. There's an eternity beyond that. And so for children who die, that is not the end. There's an eternity for them beyond that. But my point is that sometimes the older generations create a situation which brings suffering upon children. You've got another example in Numbers, the 14th chapter, and beginning there in verse 32. This is during the time of the Exodus, when God has brought Israel out of Egyptian captivity. Numbers 14 and verse 32. But as for you, in other words Israel, your dead bodies will fall in this wilderness. Also your sons will be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years, and they will suffer for your unfaithfulness until your bodies perish in the wilderness, in accordance with the number of days that you spent that you spied out the land, 40 days. For every day you shall suffer the punishment for your guilt a year, that is 40 years, and you will know my opposition. I, the Lord, have spoken. I certainly will do this to all this evil generation. All this evil congregation who are gathered together against me. They shall be worn out in this wilderness, and there they shall die. Now you might remember that from the time God brought the Israelites out of Egypt, they complained and they complained. And then he brought them to the borders of the promised land, and 12 spies were sent in, and 10 of those spies came back and said, yes, it's a great land, but we can't take it. The people there are too strong for us. And two of the spies said, of course we can. God's on our side. He's made his promises. But the people wouldn't listen. And so God intervenes. And so he says to the older generation, because of their repeated lack of faith, including at this time, you are going to die in the wilderness. And you will wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Now, yes, their children would survive to reach the promised land. But the price, if you like, that they paid was, as it says in verse 33, the children would grow up spending 40 years as nomads wandering in the wilderness. So again, parents, by their actions, created a situation where the children had to face consequences. Just one more example, and that's in 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 6 through 8. 2 Kings 17, verses 6 through 8. You will remember that the nation of Israel split following the death of Solomon around 931 BC. It split into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom, which retained the name Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. But right from the beginning, the northern kingdom of Israel turned to idolatry, made that the state religion, refused to listen to God, refused to follow his word, refused to listen to the warnings of the prophets. And so after a space of about 210 years, they went off into Assyrian captivity. And we'll read from chapter 17, verse 6. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and led the people of Israel into exile to Assyria and settled them in Halah and Habor on the river of Gozan and in the cities of the Medes. Now this came about because the sons of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up from the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and they had feared other gods, and they had also followed the customs of the nations whom the Lord had driven out from the sons of Israel. And so it goes on. So the parents, because of their sinfulness, went off into Assyrian captivity. But who else went off? The children. The children hadn't done wrong, but they went with their parents. So they also went into captivity, and just over 110 years later, the same thing happened with the people of Judah. They refused to listen to God, and so they went off into Babylonian captivity, and that led to the same thing happening with their children. So the misconduct of people brings negative consequences upon society, and children suffer as a result. And we see that happening today: drug abuse, alcoholism, gambling. We see it as a result of racial strife in various places, such as the Middle East. You know, I've seen footage in the Middle East of places where the children, Jewish children, Arabic children, Palestinian, if you want to use that term, they're playing together. They're not prejudiced, but we know that there's prejudice in the land. And as a result of that, we see the sort of thing that has been going on. And who suffers? The children suffer. And so you can probably think of various other examples. Children and infants don't create the problems, but they suffer from the problems which the older generations create. And that helps us to understand passages like Numbers 14 and verse 18. There's actually a number of passages that say the same thing, but I'm just going to take Numbers 14 and verse 18 here. The Lord is slow to anger and abundant in mercy, forgiving wrongdoing and violations of his law. But he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished. inflicting the punishment of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. You say, well, there's a contradiction. Because we read in Ezekiel that God does not punish the children for the parents' sins. Here it says God inflicts punishment of the fathers on the children to the second and third generations. But let's understand something. First of all, it is quite frequently the case that when a society becomes corrupt, that corruption is instilled in the younger generations, because the whole impact of society, including parents, raises the children in a negative way. And so the children face punishment for their own sins as well. But also there's something else, and that's what I've just talked about. Oftentimes when the older generations become corrupt, they create consequences which then result in the children suffering. And indeed, Numbers 14 is where we read about the children of Israel in the wilderness during the Exodus, and we can go back there to verses 32 and 33. But as for you, that is the older generation, your dead bodies will fall in this wilderness. Also, your sons will be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years, and they will suffer for your unfaithfulness until your bodies perish in the wilderness. What? They're held guilty, the children? No. But because Israel is going to spend 40 years in the wilderness because of the sinfulness of the older generation, then what? The children are going to be in the wilderness for 40 years as well. So they face the consequences of their parents' actions. So the activities of the parents may impact indirectly. It's not that the children are being blamed, but nevertheless, they're suffering as a result. But also the actions of the parents and the other generations can directly impact upon the children. In this case, parents can negatively teach their children by word or example, or parents can also fail to guide their children in the right path. Let's just look at 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 5 and 6. Here we've come to the latter part of the reign of King David. He's dying, basically. Now, he's already arranged that Solomon, his son, would be the next king. But we read 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 5. Now, Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. So he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen with 50 men to run before him, and he tries to take the throne for himself. He's the son of Haggith. Haggith was the wife, one of David's wives. So Adonijah is in fact a son of David. He is a prince. But what? David had already arranged that Solomon would be the next king. So Adonijah is trying to seize this for himself. And you've got a bit of an explanation in verse 6. And his father, that is David, had never rebuked him at any time by asking, why have you done so? His father had never challenged him. His father had never rebuked him. Adonijah got away with things. We might say he was spoiled. So when the matter of the throne came up, he could say, well, I'm older, I have a greater right to the throne, and therefore he tries to seize the throne. In that case, because of his father's failure to correct him whilst he was young. Or let's take another example here, 2 Chronicles 22. verses 1 to 4. In David's case, it was what David had failed to do. In this case, it's what the parent did do. Second Chronicles, I'm looking at Second Kings. Second Chronicles 22, and beginning in verse 1, then the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah, his youngest son, king in his place. So we're much later on now in Israel's history. For the band of men who came with the Arabs to the camp had killed all the older sons. So Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, began to reign. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 1 year in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri. He also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his counselor to act wickedly. So he did evil in the sight of the Lord, like the house of Ahab, for they were his counselors after the death of his father, to his own destruction. So Ahaziah comes to the throne in Judah, but what has happened? His family, the royal family of Judah, had married into the royal family at that time of Israel. And they were notorious for their evil. You have Omri, then you have Ahab who married Jezebel. And so out of all of that comes the King Ahaziah. And what does it say here? His mother was his counselor to act wickedly. His mother was descended from Ahab, who came from Omri, who were evil. And indeed, in the next verse, verse 4, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, like the house of Ahab, for they were his counselors to his own destruction. So you see here, that's one of the things about getting married, that you've got to think of the consequences on the children. In this case, certainly the mother and her family taught Ahaziah to do the wrong thing. And let's take one other example in the New Testament now, Matthew chapter 14. Matthew 14 verse 3. For when Herod had John arrested, that's John the Baptist, he bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, the wife of his brother Philip. For John had been saying to him, it is not lawful for you to have her, because she'd been married to Herod's brother. And Herod and Herodias decided they liked each other, so she walked out on her husband, and Herod married her. Verse 5, although Herod wanted to put him to death, he feared the crowd. Verse 6, but when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. And after being prompted by her mother, she said, give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter. And although he was grieved, the king commanded it to be given because of his oaths and his dinner guests. He sent word and had John beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. So here is Herodias does some type of really fancy dance, and Herod said, wow, that was great. Look, whatever you want, I will give it to you. She gets some advice from her mother. Get John the Baptist's head, because he's been the one against our marriage. So the daughter does exactly that. And you read in verse 11 that John's head is brought on a platter and given to the girl. Here you are. And she takes it off to mum. Here you are. How would you feel walking around with the head on a platter? You think, wow, she's going to turn out great. But it's whose influence? Well, you'd have to say Herod was not the greatest influence either, but certainly the mother's influence as well. The mother was taking her daughter down entirely the wrong path. So, that's a fact to consider as well, that sometimes the negative conduct of parents can directly impact the behaviour of the children, and just that's what happens today as well in many cases. We can't say always, but in many cases is what happened. I'm reading a book at the moment. It's about Rumpole of the Bailey. It was a TV series years ago, and the books were written by John Mortimer. Rumpole, Horace Rumpole. He's a barrister, a British barrister. He always works for the defence. And among his clients are the Timpson family. And the Timpson family, through the influence of the father, are pretty well all crooked. They're petty criminals. Not big time, petty criminals. There is at least one exception that I can remember, but it's gone through the whole family. And we hear of that quite regularly, well-known Sydney crime family or well-known Melbourne crime family. What is the situation? That the parents have raised their children in the ways of the parents. So the criminal activities pass on. And it happens in various ways. I've had a long association with the school here, and I've been here at times when parents rip into one of the school principals. It hasn't happened for a while now, but thinking back over the years, you've got a child that's misbehaving, and some sort of action is taken, and in comes mum or dad, and they tear strips off the principal, and in a big way. And I've been there when that's been happening. And you think, well, you're not helping your child. What are you teaching your child when you won't allow the school to do something? Now, I repeat what I've said before. Parents are not always, they're not automatically the cause of their children's problems. They're not automatically the cause of their children's bad behaviour, but they can be. And so what's the message in all of this? Well, we started at John chapter 9, and Jesus' disciples assumed that because the man had been born blind, somebody was to blame. Either it was the man himself, which is not logical, or it must have been the parents. But Jesus said, no, that's not the case. We cannot automatically assume that a person's problems, a person's bad behaviour, are the fault of the parents. But it can and does happen at times that parents are the cause. Children, as I've said, must grow up to take responsibility for their own behaviour. But nevertheless, we who are parents need to take a good look at ourselves and say, okay, what impact am I having? And you look at all sorts of behaviour: drug addiction, alcoholism, gambling, neglect, laziness. Such things can all make life miserable for their children. And also parents can, through example and training, conditioning, set their children on the wrong path. They can also do that by neglecting to train or to correct their children, as we saw with the case of David and his son Adonijah. In a nutshell, parents, and indeed the whole older society have an impact upon the children, whether good or bad. Now, we might sit here and say, well, I'm not a parent, but nevertheless, even if we're not a parent of the children that are here, we are still having an impact, because children still see what goes on and learn from that. So all of us, particularly parents, but all of us, need to take a good look at ourselves. Are we living life in such a way that we're creating problems which make life hard for our children? Are we raising children in such a way that we are training them, influencing them to follow the wrong path? And as I said, all of us can look at this. What sort of example are we setting to the children any time that we gather? And particularly when we're parents. And I've gone through this myself. And there are things I wish I could do over again. But you can't undo what happens. So let's not make the mistake that Jesus' disciples did. Let's not automatically assume that in all situations it's the parents that are at fault, because that's not so. But let us all, as parents and as the older generation, look at ourselves to see that whatever impact we have on the children, it's a good, positive impact. Where do we learn that from? From the Bible. Let's stand and sing.